Welcome to the City Club of Portland. My name is Patty Bedient, and I'm the president-elect of the City Club, and I'm standing in today for Jim Westwood, our president, who is unable to be with us. I'd like to start today by doing one of our favorite activities here at the City Club, and that is the introduction of new members. They're seated down here at the table in front, and I would ask them to stand as I read their name, and please hold your applause until I've introduced all three of them that can be with us today. First of all is Bill Edmonds, Public Policy Analyst, Pacific Power. Joyce Hine, Attorney, Schwabe, Williamson & Wyatt. John Soyson, Director of Public Relations, University of Portland. Please give them a warm welcome. Before we get on with today's program, we do have a number of announcements. First of all, next Friday's program, September 13th, will feature William Boyer, President Emeritus, University of Hawaii, speaking on environmental rights for future generations, The Impossible Dream. Boyer, a native Oregonian and author of America's Future, Transition to the 21st Century, will discuss the proposed public initiative to guarantee future generations of Oregonians environmental rights. If adopted in 1992, the initiative will be the first set of such rights to be adopted in the United States. The program will be here in the Benson, the Mayfair room. Following that Friday, on September 20th, Steve Wasserstrom, PhD and Assistant Professor of Judaic Studies and the Humanities at Reed College, will speak on Misrepresenting Muslims, Observations on the Gulf War. Again, the program will be here in the Benson. Governor Barbara Roberts will hold her Portland kickoff of Conversations with Oregonians on Sunday, September 22nd, 12:30 p.m. at the Oregon Convention Center. City Club members have the opportunity to attend and be involved in this process, which will allow citizens to have a voice in developing plans to overhaul Oregon's tax system. City Club members interested in volunteering to serve in this very important activity for our state are urged to attend. You'll note that in this week's bulletin, City Club members have an opportunity to meet, travel, and ski Europe. Sounds like a lot of fun, although with today's heat, I'm not sure I can focus on snow. But it will be in conjunction with the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, and City Club is co-sponsoring a 9-day ski trip and tour to Engelberg, Switzerland, from February 28th to March 7th of 1992. Those of you who are interested can contact Nancy Hedin, our Executive Director, for more information. All of you received in the mail this last week a special President's letter announcing the 4 spectacular events planned for our 75th anniversary celebration beginning September 27th. And it's going to be a lot of fun, so please mark your calendars today for these very 4 special Friday events, and you'll be receiving more information and how to make reservations for attendance. In this past week's bulletin, the club published an information report called A Survey of Leadership Training in the Portland Metropolitan Area. I hope all of you had a chance to review the report. The report was prepared in response to request to the City Club from the Portland Civic Index Synthesis Committee as part of the final Civic Index report to the city in the spring of 1990. Our president at that time, Mary Kramer, appointed the Leadership Development Opportunities Task Force to prepare this report. With us today is the chair of that task force, Carol Mason, to present the report. Carol, would you please come forward?
Thank you, Patty. Good afternoon. I would like to take an opportunity before I tell you very briefly what that report was about and what the committee did to introduce the people that I served with. Mary Kramer gave me a committee that was absolutely outstanding in terms of its representation of civic leadership in the community. I'd like you to welcome them as soon as they all stand, please. We have Don Ballinger, Senior Vice President of United Way of the Columbia Willamette, Patrick Donaldson, Executive Director of the Oregon Citizens Crime Commission, Anna McManus, Vice President with NOAA, And we also, Patty Bedient also served with us as our research advisor with the City Club. Not with us today are Carol Turner of Portland State University and Chris Tomlinson, who's the executive director of the Oregon Child Care Commission. Would you please give them a hand of thanks? As Patty mentioned, this was an outgrowth of a survey of this community conducted in 1989 and 1990 by the Civic Index process. Basically, what that process was all about is taking a look at our civic infrastructure, and one of the elements was that of leadership. It was concluded by a whole variety of civic leaders that we needed to get more people involved in this community in civic leadership roles, that there might be a scarcity of ways to do that. A lot of people, if there were programs out there, they didn't know how to connect with them. It was our task to survey all of the social service organizations, the neighborhood associations, chambers of commerce, and some other groups out there that have volunteer boards to find out what they do for their volunteers in terms of helping them get into the organization and then become effective board members once they're there. We surveyed over 500 organizations. About 25% of those responded. We found that only 17 of those 500 organizations actually had programs that we defined as promoting civic leadership. 17 was not very many organizations for a city for a metropolitan area this large. We did find, however, there are about another 50 organizations that provided programs in-house. They weren't open to the general public, but they did provide them for themselves. And those organizations said, we have some resources here, and we'd be willing to consider sharing them with the rest of the community. But unfortunately, Portland doesn't have any kind of an umbrella agency or any other group that really oversees all that and coordinates that kind of activity in this community. So nothing's happening. The report includes the list of organizations, and I'm not going to go through those for you. There's some very active chambers, there's some very active colleges and city clubs on that list. We were not to come up with conclusions, but what we ended up summing up out of this whole process is that there are a lot of people who'd like to get involved, don't really know how. There are not very many programs for them to get into the system or to become effective once they're in the system. And that if we really want to increase our strength as a community, that we need to pay some attention to that. Our personal conviction, our committee conviction, is that City Club probably is ideally positioned because of its people resources, all of the civic leaders who already serve in this organization, because of its community service focus, and because of its organizational strengths, that it may want to play a role in trying to develop further some leadership development opportunities or programs in this community. We have some good examples to look at. Seattle has a very professionally run, sophisticated system that involves and creates a very diverse group of civic leaders. We can look around the country and find others. We have some models out there. We're hoping, our committee hopes, that City Club will now take the baton. We have this list, it's a very short list. Now we need to decide what else we want to do in terms of bringing more people into the process and having them be very strong civic leaders when they're there. Thank you very much.
Carol, thanks again. And although this is an information report different from our long-range study committee reports that do carry conclusions and recommendations, this does not have conclusions and recommendations. But I will tell you that the report was received with great interest by the Board of Governors, and we'll continue to review that. Our board host today, seated at the head table, is Chuck Williams. Chuck is a member of the Board of Governors and the communications manager for Good Samaritan Hospital. He has the privilege of asking the first question. The second question will go to Anna McManus, who is the chair of the Human Services Standing Committee. Following their questions, in the tradition of City Club, we will open up the meeting to questions from other City Club members. Also, there are forms for anyone who wants to submit their question in the form of a written question and can hand those to staff who will be gathering them after our speaker today. Just a little more than a year ago, Oregon lacked a coherent housing policy, and given diminishing federal support, the state has had to assume a stronger role in the housing agenda. During the recent legislature, the state added some tools for success by creating the Housing Trust Fund and merging the state community services with the housing agency. Rey Ramsey, Director of the State Housing and Community Services Department, is with us today to speak about Oregon's housing and emerging anti-poverty agenda. Mr. Ramsey formerly served as the Director of the State Housing Agency. Prior to entering public service, he was an attorney with Stoll Reeves, Boley, Jones, and Gray. He's a member of the American Leadership Forum and serves on the board of the Portland Community Reinvestment Initiatives. He chaired Governor Barbara Roberts' Transition Team Subcommittee on Housing. Please join me in welcoming Rey Ramsey to the City Club.
Thank you, Patty. First, I'd like to thank everyone here for giving me this special opportunity to share with you. And I'd also like to thank my parents, although they're not here. They're 3,000 miles away and in New Jersey, and they would be here if they could. And I'd also like to thank my wife, who's seated to my right at the head table here, for giving me the chance to be up here today and having an incredible amount of patience, because I'll tell you, serving on that transition team as well as trying to run the agency took up a lot of time, so I appreciate that. I'd also like to share a personal reflection with you, and I think that it'll show that when you dream of things that are possible and believe in things that are necessary, that positive things can and do happen. And I'd like to just go back a little bit in my time in New Jersey. I was at Rutgers University a few years ago. It's getting longer every day, but a few years ago, and I was taking a course called Housing and Urban Development. And I had a friend of mine ask me, why are you taking a course in housing and urban development? I mean, that sounds awfully boring. You're going to be doing Section 8 stuff and rules and regulations. There's nothing glamorous about it. It wasn't astronomy, or it wasn't physics, or it wasn't anything like that. And I said to the person, and I'll never forget this because it stays in my heart, I said, because one day I hope that I will have the opportunity to run a housing department for a state. That was 1981, that was 10 years ago, and I was in New Jersey at that time. Since went on from there to go to law school in Virginia, and then spent time actually living in Central Oregon in Bend, and here I am today, 10 years later, actually having the opportunity to run a housing department for a state. At the time, I was hoping it was New Jersey. Now I'm glad it's Oregon, and that's nothing against my old state, but I am glad it's Oregon. And out of that story, I really believe that if you think about the possible and the necessary, you can get there. And there's a message in that for where we're going with public policy. And that's one thing I'd like for everyone to take away from this today, is that belief in the necessary and the possible. Because I like to use the analogy of painting a picture. And if you paint a picture in your mind about what can be, and then you go out and you acquire the tools, and in the case of a painter, it's the tool brushes, then you paint a picture. That's all you have to do once you have the tools. You paint the picture. And then you just perfect it and you work on it over time. And so that analogy of a portrait, of a painting, of a picture stays in my mind, the belief in what's necessary and the belief in what's possible. Many people say that we have lost the war on poverty and that affordable housing is a pipe dream. They say, forget about it, it can't be done, private sector's not going to be able to do it, we really don't have much of a chance. They say that we're throwing money down a rat hole when the state or the federal government invest in these programs. They question the wisdom of government intervention. I don't agree with that, obviously, or else I wouldn't be here today. And I think if we step back and look at history, we can learn a little bit about why I think some of those assumptions are wrong, and it ties in with where we're headed today. When we think about anti-poverty, I think the best starting point is to go back to the Johnson administration. Now, obviously, that president took some of his ideas from President Kennedy, but he did become enamored with the war on poverty, as he called it. His main idea was to focus on community action. Now, what does that mean? Community action at that time, it was an intentionally vague idea, and it was subject to a wide array of interpretation. The theory was that poor people needed neighborhood-based organizations to help serve them as neighborhood planning bodies, as neighborhood planning boards, that these ideas would be bottom-up, that the communities would come up with the ideas through their community action agencies and take programs from the federal government and from the state. The ideas would all be developed locally. It was a great concept in theory, but it never really quite worked that way. Obviously, we had some failures. I don't believe that we can't get back to that, but we had some failures, and there's some reasons why. All of the tools, as I mentioned earlier, a painter needs a paintbrush. All of the tools for the community action agencies were never totally in place. They never had everything they needed. There's a temptation of policymakers to throw small resources at large problems. Poverty was a major problem, and still is, but a major problem back in the 60s when Johnson got started, but they piecemealed their way through. The community action agencies never had all of the resources that they needed. They never had all of the coordination that was needed. There were times of highly publicized failures, and we look at mismanagement. We look at the fact that some of the programs didn't make it, and this was getting a lot of publicity. Also, one of the fundamental mistakes was that a lot of the politicians, congressmen and other individuals, were threatened by community action because they couldn't control it, and it was the grassroots efforts, and so they did things to sabotage it. It's well documented in Chicago that Mayor Daley wasn't a fan of community action. So every mistake was magnified so that eventually we still have community action, and we still called it community action over the decades, but it wasn't what it was supposed to be. And now people stand there and say, well, it failed. We didn't give them the tools that they need to be successful. We had eroding public support because of all of this. They didn't have the tools. People saw the well-documented failures, so now public support started to decrease. The boards of the community action agencies were originally designed to be made up of a majority of low-income people. Then after a while, as the politicians and others started to lack faith, they started to pull back from that. And so they said, well, let's, instead of having 51%, let's go to a third from the business community, a third from lower income people, and a third from other groups. Let's kind of scale that back a little bit. So we started to lose a little bit there. Then dramatically, in 1980, through the last 12 years or the last 11 years, we've seen an unbelievable cutback in programs that community action agencies, that housing authorities, and other groups needed. We saw a cutback from the federal level of resources. In particular, HUD, their budget. You can argue about what programs they're using, but you can't argue with the basic fact, and that is that their budget was cut anywhere between 70 to 75% when you look at it at the start of 1980 to today. Now, we had that massive cut in HUD, and then we look at problems and programs and say, well, they're not working. Well, how is it going to work when it never really had all of its tools, and you cut something's budget by 75%? People say to me, well, it seems like this homeless problem has started to really get started in the last few years. I wonder why that is. Well, you cut the HUD budget by 75%. The state was never really a player in the area of affordable housing before. In 1986, we had the Tax Act that took away a lot of the incentive for the private sector to be involved in housing. And by the way, I do not believe that the private sector can totally do this alone. Some people say, well, that's the only reason. It's just the Tax Act of '86, and that stopped it. We had a lot of units. We have always had a problem with housing our most needy and our special needs population, always. Before 1986 and after 1986. What happened was it exacerbated the problem. And so you look at this gutting and the lack of support and the well-publicized failure, and we think about community action. What we did was we took the action out of community action. What we have to do to get back on track, I believe, is look inside of ourselves and go back to what I believe personally, at least for me, and have that belief in the necessary and the possible. And you know, we talk a lot about phrases and everything else, but one phrase sticks in my mind. People talk about the mantle being passed, the torch being passed. The mantle has long been passed to us. We're the generation now that's responsible for this. Each of us represents a part of this generation. And we have a legacy that we're going to leave. We have a responsibility. I believe we have a responsibility to improve. I believe we have a responsibility to enhance. And I believe we have a responsibility to correct. And the legacy that our generation, all of us, are leaving behind is an ugly picture. It's not a pretty picture. The painting is not a pretty one. For a great many Oregonians, housing is unsafe, unsanitary, and unaffordable, if at all available. We have vacancy rates in this state in some communities that is below 1%. How do you find a home? When I moved to Central Oregon from Portland, I had to have the publisher of the newspaper basically tuck away an apartment for me and tell me about it so that I would be able to move there and be able to live there. Otherwise, I was going to have to stay in a hotel or a motel. And I think I had a reasonably well-paying job, and I couldn't find something that could fit my needs unless I was going to go and stay at Mount Bachelor and pay $1,200 a month. And that wasn't quite the state salary would quite accommodate that. So I would run into a problem because of the housing situation there, and it was moderate income. What about those folks that are living along the Deschutes River and staying in parks? They don't have a place. So it's unavailable, if at all affordable. There are greater instances of homelessness, as I mentioned. The numbers aren't quite clear, but it's not really important what the number is. It may be 3,000. It may be 5,000. It may be a little bit more, depending on who you talk to about the numbers of homeless. And I told you earlier about why we have increasing numbers of homeless. There's a reason for that. So, and in addition to that, an alarming statistic that I just learned was that in Oregon, the estimates are that 1/3 of the homeless individuals in this state are veterans. And that was startling to me. I mean, we have veteran services. We have a department that takes care of that. Why are we not? We have an identified population. What's the problem? Are we that unorganized that we can't identify the population there with the veterans, people who have served in this country, and provide them a decent place to live? We had what was called the Stand Down recently, and that's where veterans organizations and a number of vets got together down by Jansen Beach to provide services for the vets. We had a court system there so people could get their records clean. We had the adult and family services so people could get services. We had the employment division there that could sign people up with job referrals. And as I was going through there and I heard those numbers, what I came away saying is we will have a veterans response plan to deal with that segment of the homelessness. Why are we not making sure we set aside some of our monies, some of our rental assistance monies, that we can couple with some of the other programs that vets have to take care of that identifiable population that is homeless? Why are we not doing that? So these are some of the things that are going to grow out of that. Hunger in this state. We have a hunger task force that was formed a couple of years ago. They studied the issue and obviously discovered some things that were obvious, but some new things. We have much greater instances of homelessness than we ever imagined. And there are a great many kids that have poor nutrition. Too many children in this state go to bed hungry at night. And it's sort of like a quiet little secret. We don't quite see that. So what are we going to do about that? Again, this is a picture that we cannot be proud of. But I'm an optimist, as I said earlier, about dreaming for things, because being 3,000 miles away in New Jersey and believing that I was going to, even in New Jersey, which is hard to kind of move up the ladder, believing that I could run a department of housing for a state, I'm an optimist. So I believe in Oregon, I always say, I think it is a new day in this state because I feel something very special is happening, although it's in the early stages. Perhaps for the first time, Oregon has a comprehensive housing agenda and the groundwork for what we like to call a human investment strategy. We have a governor, Governor Barbara Roberts, who has supported this cause from day one and every step of the way committed. Our housing agenda going into this past legislative session was short but comprehensive. And we had to fight our way through that. I had an advantage because I was on the transition team, and some people said, well, gosh, you put the head of the agency over the transition team that deals with this area. No wonder they're going to come out of this with some resources. Well, we did come out of it with some resources. But what's important is it was a short list, but it was comprehensive. The cornerstone of that agenda that I talk about is that we needed some tools. I go back to my analogy of the painter. You need a paintbrush to get a picture. You need a paintbrush, so we needed some tools. The Oregon Housing Trust Fund, House Bill 2779, was the culmination of the dreams and hopes of a great many people. They've been talking about a trust fund in this state for probably the last 6 years, and we got rejected every time at the legislature. And so that became my obsession, quite frankly, when I took this job 14 months ago, working with the Housing Authority, the Housing Lobby Coalition, banks, realtors, bipartisan legislative support. The city of Portland, individuals from all over the state got together as one massive coalition and promoted this legislation. It wasn't just my department. We had the leadership of the governor, which was very important to get started, and we had bipartisan support, but it was that grassroots. That was community action at work from all across the sectors in the community. We had very few votes against us, and people couldn't understand it with Measure 5. And keeping in mind the state had never made a general fund investment ever. My department had never received general fund. We operate off of our bond programs, never had general fund money. Forget lottery money, we never had lottery money. Now we have some of that. The trust fund, in essence, is a $25 million appropriation from the legislature. And the way it breaks down very briefly is that we're going to put $14 million aside so the $14 million can forever be used for affordable housing, to acquire housing, to rehab, and to build low-income housing and deal with special needs populations. Then we recognized, though, that we couldn't just wait for the interest to accrue off of the $25 million or the $14 million, and so we said we need about $6 million. We'd have liked to have had more, but you know, the legislative process, you get what you can and you run with it. So we took the $6 million, and what we're going to do with it is we're going to divide it up on a per capita basis across the state and give everybody in regions of the state an opportunity to put forward good projects. Now, what we're looking for in those projects is leverage. We don't want to just, if somebody comes in and says, I have a $100,000 project, I'm not going to hand them a $100,000 check. I want to be able to maximize that. So I see that $6 million basically turning into about $30 million of investment in this state into low-income housing. Why do I believe we can get $30 million? Well, we studied all the other states in the country. There are 25 other states that have trust funds. They were able to leverage their dollars from a high of 9-to-1 to a low of 3-to-1. So our first time out of the gate, we ought to be able to do about 5-to-1 in Oregon, and I think we're going to get there. So I believe that's a $30 million investment right out of the blocks. Then we have $5 million for emergency housing assistance. And I'll describe that a little bit later, and there's a reason for that because it ties in with community action, and we're going to go about using those funds in a slightly different way. But there were other tools that we got out of this session. Again, we were trying to build a toolbox, and you need some more things. We have a tax credit that Oregon lending institutions can make available to nonprofits and government entities. They can write down their interest rates by as much as 4% and then get a corresponding tax credit from the state. We were given the ability to do $32 million in loans. Couple that with the $30 million I mentioned earlier of leverage. Now we're talking about $62 million of funds that we intend to put into the affordable housing arena in the next 2 years. That's quite an investment. In addition, we have what's called a low-income rental fund, where we take interest off of refundable deposits from renters. We pool it together for a rental fund to help families with 6 months of rental assistance. We will pay for 6 months of rent for a family so they can get on their feet, so they can get to be self-reliant. And what's important about that is we're basically saying to the family, worry about the other parts of your life, pull those parts together, and we'll take care of the rent while you're getting your courses taken, while you're looking for a job, maybe in the transition between a separation or a divorce, where we have high instances of poverty. And we have 11 pilot projects around the state, and our success rate that we measure by getting a family from homelessness or near homelessness into a quality situation of housing is 80%. Find another program that has that kind of percentage. 80% is what we're running right now. And so that's running pretty well. The second part of our housing agenda is technical assistance and community capacity building. It's very important to realize that after the federal government cut its programs by the amounts that I said, 75%, that it's no longer easy to put the projects together. In the past, when you had a low-income project, you would think, well, I'm going to call HUD, I'll go to the Housing Authority, and you do a Section 202, or you do one of these projects that they have, and that's pretty much where you did it. You didn't go to the state. And there weren't as many community development corporations. That's where you got it done. Now with those cutbacks, it's a lot more difficult. Now you've got to go to the Home Loan Bank. Maybe you have to deal with the Resolution Trust Corporation. Maybe now you're going to deal with the state. You still have the housing authorities. Maybe you're going to deal with the city now because the city is going to make some donations and do some things to help with housing. So it's a mosaic that we have to pull together, and it's a lot more difficult. So what we're going to do, part of the answer is hiring some people at the state level that we call development officers, housing development officers, who will be assigned to different regions of the state and who will be responsible and, as importantly, accountable for bringing back successful housing projects. I'm not sending them out there without tools, as I mentioned. They have some tools to work with. Now they're going to work with communities, they're going to work with for-profit entities, and they're going to work with developers and housing authorities to bring back successful projects. And the belief in this was confirmed when we were working on what's called CHAS, which is a comprehensive housing affordability strategy. I got that out. And what it is a strategy that we have to do statewide for housing. And what we learned as we've surveyed around the state is that technical assistance and community capacity building rated very, very high across the board in all 6 regions of the state. We've divided the state into 6 regions. In all 6 regions, that was high. So our instincts were right that that was an important piece to do. The other part that sometimes sounds trite, but is so important, and that is building partnerships. We've got to have partnerships in order to garner success. In order to say that we've done a good job, we need to be able to work with people in the field, because they're going to have answers to problems that we could not begin to think of at the state. And I must say that my job as far as Portland has been made a heck of a lot easier because of the work out of Commissioner Kafoury's office. When she took over in City Council and consolidated a lot of the housing issues together, I was applauding on the side because I knew that we needed that leadership in the city, and we have it. And you look at a couple of things I'd like to highlight out of that partnership. The Housing Center in Portland, a major endeavor. What we've done is, the city has done actually, is put together this housing center, making it into a nonprofit so that families can get closer to home ownership. And they're doing a lot of referrals in there daily. And I spend some time coming into the office because we contributed some money, and we spend some of our time sitting in on that office providing whatever we can. But another thing that I feel is very significant is the pursuit of the Dominion Capital properties. You may have heard about that in the news, that there was the fraud involved, and now it's bankruptcy, and it's in the hands of the trustee. Gretchen Kafoury and her office basically was the lightning rod for putting together a nonprofit in the community that would try to acquire these units. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of units that could otherwise be open to speculation, that would otherwise push people out, gentrify the community, change the face of what we might want in our community. Why not have a nonprofit be in the middle of that? So we're trying to acquire those houses, and I say we because, as it was mentioned earlier, I'm on the board, the advisory board, and my job is public information, trying to get information about what we do, and obviously try to make a linkage between their efforts and the state. And right now, we're trying to get those houses from the trustee. We have an offer on the table, and we are hoping that the appraisal will be accurate and fair so that we will be able to acquire those houses. If the appraisal is too high, it's going to make it very difficult for that nonprofit to be able to do it. So that's what we're hoping for. So partnerships are crucial. The third part of our housing agenda, and perhaps the most important, is to develop a holistic approach to housing. We recognize that putting a person in a house is not necessarily enabling that person to become self-reliant. Services obviously have to be provided. Does it make sense to build a 200-unit apartment complex for low-income families and make no provision for daycare? Or does it make sense to ignore the energy and utility needs of low-income families? And what about nutrition counseling for the children? Our first step on this agenda is to combine two state agencies, as was mentioned earlier. State Community Services, which handles the community action programs that was in the Department of Human Resources, combining that together with the Oregon Housing Agency, my old department as it was called. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the state was never a player really in the larger arena of affordable housing. Up to a year or so ago, all we basically did was run our bond programs. I think we did it pretty good, and the staff there was a good one, but all it entailed was first-time home buyer programs, basically moderate income, a little bit of low income, might be able to trickle up and buy a house. Then we had the ability to do some elderly housing and some disabled housing, small but good, quality program, very passive. You approached us, and that was it. If you didn't approach us, you didn't know anything about the program, and that was it. Now the recognition that we have to do more. The federal government is not quite the player they were. They're coming back a little bit, because I think some things are changing, but they're not quite the player they used to be. So the state has evolved, and now we've brought in community services. I think merging them together is the easy part. I don't want to go back to the next session and say to the legislature, well, I've saved you a little bit of money, it's run a little bit better, we've done a decent job of managing. I will consider that I have failed in my job as far as the merger. To make it successful, we have to meet a challenge, and that challenge is working again with our local partners, the community action agencies, the community development corporations, the housing authorities, and the private sector. And as I mentioned earlier, we took the action out of community action. We want to put it back in. We want to put the action back into community action. This, as I like to call it, is an agenda of commitment, because that is what it's going to take, commitment. Community action agencies, in particular, have the potential to rekindle the original intent of their designers. They were intended to be small, flexible, non-bureaucratic agencies, local decision-making, as I mentioned earlier, that they would make a concerted effort to find out what individuals need most, that they would, importantly, inspire people to commit their time and their efforts. Now, we will begin this effort by distributing our $5 million of emergency assistance out of the trust fund, as I talked about earlier. To get back to that, we have $5 million. And instead of having a statewide RFP process where we would make decisions at my level and say, well, maybe we'll set aside 5% here, 10% there, 20% there for the available uses, it makes a lot more sense to distribute that money out, not so much that the community action agencies are going to spend the money, but the challenge to them is to involve the community. Again, action. Involve the community in the process of deciding on what is important to them. Because in some communities, they may want to choose rental assistance for 80% of their emergency needs. Maybe they want it to all go to shelters. Or what about domestic violence centers? The importance of that houses a significant number of people that would otherwise be homeless. Maybe that's the need in a particular community. How would I be able to know that? How could I make that decision at the state level? I think we're wrong when we're at the state and we try to make all of those decisions. And I see this as important because it's a model, I think, for the future of how state government can run, and that is with local delivery systems. I don't ever want to have branch offices of the housing department scattered throughout the state, because I'm not going to know as well. We're going to be detached. But what I can do is make sure when we distribute that money that we hold people accountable for community action and involvement, and that this money is spent prudently and wisely. And that's how we're going to begin our efforts to put action back into it. And secondly, we're going to work with other active groups or individuals to help restructure the dialogue. And what I mean by that is that collectively, as a society, we spend too much time debating certain issues that I feel are really hackneyed, that we spend too much time on. And there are three of them, in my opinion. One is we spend a lot of time debating what are the limits of our social obligation. We spend a whole lot of time talking about what does society have to put into this? Why do we have to put this in? And we have raging problems, large problems, and we debate this over and over again. What do we get out of that? We debate it. Sounds good, but we debate it a lot. We spend a lot of time dealing with how do we categorize poor people? Are they poor on their way out, or are they poor on their way down? How do we categorize them? And I call that a cottage industry that is raised up out of that. We spend a lot of time studying that to death. Then we spend a lot of time dealing with, well, what are the limits of social programs? Isn't this going to have an impact on people's morale if they get these programs? They're not going to feel good about themselves. Well, boy, a warm bed is not too bad. It's better than staying on the street. Do we really need to debate that? We spend a lot of time. So that may seem kind of esoteric, but we've got to shift the debate if we're going to be successful. Because only one successful legislative session isn't going to get us all the way to where we need to be. So we need to start changing the focus of that debate, because we intend to come in the next session not just with a comprehensive housing program like we did before, but now with this combination at the state, we really need to deal with the poverty question as a concise, consistent agenda, tying in services and housing. And so we need to reshape that debate. We need to move into dealing with the issue of investment. As I mentioned earlier, human investment. Let's make an investment in our people and then expect a return on that investment. How about a block grant for people? We give block grants to communities to decide on what they need to do. Isn't it better to perhaps give that individual a chance to make certain choices in their life about what services they need? It's like you go into a shopping center and you buy groceries because you know what you need to eat, what you want to eat, what's going to make you get over, what's going to make you feel better. What about a block grant for people? Instead of having everybody decide, well, we'll send you to this office for this program. Now you need to go down the hall for that program. You need this, and you only get this amount, and $6 worth of that, and $5 worth of that. Well, maybe I need $10 worth of that. Do you know better than I know? A block grant for people. Maybe that's something we ought to think about. And what about, it's not a question of how much we spend, but how we spend it. And to me, it's not a question of can we afford to make these investments? Instead, it's a question of can we afford the consequences of not investing? You know, something that always sticks out at me when you see that person standing on the street and they say, and they have a sign that says, we'll work for food. The thing I always keep in mind is not every one of those people are faking. You know, we always tend to think, well, oh yeah, right, this big guy, he looks well fed, and he's holding that sign. Not every one of those people who are standing there are faking. And what are we doing about that? That's the picture that we're painting. That's the legacy that we're putting together as our generation. The lack of investment that we've made. We've pulled that money back. The money is somewhere else. We've pulled it back. We haven't made that investment. I believe it will take the implementation and the enhancement of our comprehensive plan that I talked a little bit about today, the thoughts, the commitment, and the participation of many of us, and a willingness to collectively search for, again, what I say is the necessary and the possible, so that we can paint this good picture that I'm alluding to. It's going to take that. And I like to look back on certain philosophers, and I don't make quotes very often, but there was a political philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, and he implied that society must be based upon, and I quote, real unity. Otherwise, we will digress into a war of every man against every man. And that's something to think about. And he said that many years ago. I believe, and many others share that, as I mentioned about our housing agenda, is that with an agenda based on commitment, that we will be able to get the job done, that we will be able to paint the kind of picture that we need. That's my personal commitment. That's the commitment of this governor, I know that for sure, and many individuals around the state. As I said earlier, it's a new day in Oregon, and I feel something very special is happening right now. Thank you.
Ray, thank you very much. We are now putting the microphone in the middle of the floor for people to ask their questions. Again, if you don't want to approach the microphone, you can fill out the forms that are on the table, and we'll have our first question, as I mentioned before, from Chuck Williams.
This is the softball one, right?
That's the one you gave me before the...
Right, okay, that's what I thought. Get it right now.
Well, New Jersey sends us Rey Ramsey, and we send New Jersey Sam Bowie. Good trade, I think. And we get Buck Williams along with a deal. I think we came out all right.
I have a better jump shot.
I salute you on the passion and the information provided to us today. That was an excellent speech. One thing I wish you'd spend a little bit more time on, and that is you seem to have forsaken what help we may get at the federal level. And certainly we know about the history of problem and corruption. Hopefully it's been cleaned up in the last couple of years. What kind of assistance can we expect from Washington? Certainly if our colleges and universities and some other institutions have done fairly well in that arena, can we expect some improvement in the new administration?
I believe that there is some, as I alluded to the fact that I think things are changing a little bit there. We have what's called the HOME program, which will be a block grant. Not necessarily more money coming in, but they are going to eliminate several other programs, combine it together in a block grant, give it to the states without any administrative money, but they're still going to give it to the states for us to administer. We're not sure what Oregon's amount is going to be. We're estimating that we may get about $11 million for the non-entitlement areas, meaning outside of Portland and Medford and Salem, that we would get from the federal government. In addition to that, we at the state recognize that we still have to be able to play in that arena. And so one of the things that I did when I restructured the department was I added a position that would deal a great deal with the legislature, both here in Oregon and also in Washington. And John Blatt is here today from my staff. And what we did was we put together a proposal with the housing authorities. We call it opportunity purchases. And what that is, it's a land banking concept. We went to Senator Hatfield and Representative Aucoin and ask them, since they were both on appropriations, to help us. And we asked for a couple $1 million so that every housing authority in the state would be able to get $100,000 to purchase land. And realizing that, well, land keeps going up in cost, and so if a housing authority can grab that, it's going to make the housing less costly to them. And also the issue of availability of land, and also the primacy of where you want to locate it. We have light rail coming in and issues like that. Let's try to make sure that we locate the housing in places that make sense. So the Housing Authority, it looks very good, is going to get that money through us. It passed through both houses in Washington, and it's in conference committee. And the report last week that it looks pretty good. So we had to go there and carve it out, basically, carve out a piece for Oregon. It's the first time we've done anything like that, and it won't be the last time. We're going to keep going back and battling. So we haven't forsaken that, but clearly with that kind of cut, we're never going to get back to where we used to be, and the state was never a player before. So that's why I emphasize that.
Anna McManus will ask the next question.
Get this down a little bit here.
All right.
Mr. Ramsey, that was an excellent, informative presentation, and going back to your image of the picture that your agency is painting and the tools that you need to do that, I wondered if you could tell us whether Treasurer Meeker's bond moratorium has any effect on your ability to do that, and if so, in what ways?
Okay. Well, we do two different types of bonds at the department. One is revenue bonds, and we use that program for our first-time home buyers, and we make the money available through banks, and then families are able to go there if they have the income qualifications and get a very low interest rate to buy a house. Fortunately, that program is not effective. On the general obligation side, which means that if we have defaults, you encumber the general obligation of the state, we have used that money to fund elderly and disabled projects. We've been able to do about probably $40 million a year of that kind of housing all across the state, congregate care, assisted living facilities, residential care facilities. I can't do that right now. So that's obviously having some impact, because I have had people come in with projects. So those projects are right now all on hold until this moratorium is lifted. So I can't do any elderly and disabled housing, and as well, we have a situation where we have been doing the downsizing at Fairview Hospital, and obviously that's going to come to a hold as we start running out of the money that we had off of our past bond issues. So there is an impact, and in the interest of housing for the state, I hope that the moratorium does not last a long period of time.
Ramsey White, club member. Hi, Ray.
Good name.
Yeah, isn't that something? My clients used to call me Mr. Ramsey all the time. That's great. One of the reasons I think that the Community Action Commission boards have had increasing private representation is because of the private sector participation in some of the initiatives. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your strategies in dealing with lending institutions or other private sector participants in some of these projects.
Crucial. I think one of the ways we displayed our interest in having the private sector involved was when we were formulating the trust fund. The trust fund is available for nonprofits as well as for-profits. If a for-profit entity can build a unit and keep those units affordable and still make a profit off of it, we're going to work with them. Our issue is getting the units done to end some of the suffering. And it doesn't matter to me who is doing it and what the labor or the corporate structure is. So we're very much interested in working with the private sector. We've been working with the banks. When we did the Oregon Lenders Tax Credit, as I mentioned earlier, that's going to be the banks. And what we're doing now is we're writing the administrative rules, is we have a subcommittee working with the bankers and saying to them, you help us draft these rules in a way that's going to help you to participate, because I need you to participate. This program, $32 million worth of loans in there aren't going to work unless it's designed for the banks to be able to utilize it. So they are crucial. Can't do it without the private sector. Absolutely.
Jean DeMaster, City Club member. Hi. Our experience in terms of providing services to the homeless at Burnside projects, transition projects, is that the major cause of homelessness for single men and women, including veterans, is alcohol and drug abuse. Right. And clearly alcohol and drug abuse provides some major cause of homelessness for families. Mm-hmm. My question is, what will the State Housing Agency do in terms of long-term support for alcohol and drug-free housing and for continuing care for people that have alcohol and drug problems and need assistance over a long period of time, not just 3 months or 6 months?
Sure. Well, there are a few things. One is, as you know, we have funded a few of the entities around that are dealing with that issue. We've never had very many resources. As we go out with this emergency money, that's precisely why, if the needs are that way in this particular community, that you will have a chance at some of those funds locally. We're not going to say X amount has to go to that, but you're going to work with the community action process to figure out how much of those funds you're going to be able to access. Those are eligible service issues for emergency housing. The other thing is that our partnership with the Department of Human Resources that houses most of the drug and alcohol programs are crucial. We're just starting to get some expertise and learning about the process. We don't have all the answers. We're trying to work with DHR to get those. One thing that we're doing, though, is working with mental health, and we've hired someone to look at the patients that are in there and what their housing needs are, then look in the community and survey what kind of housing is available to accommodate those needs, obviously identifying a gap, and then targeting some of our resources to make sure we can address some of that gap. So in the mental health area and some of the alcohol and drug patients or individuals or victims are part of that process as well. They're going to be well served by that process. So we're starting to look for those partnerships. It's just going to take time, and we're new at this. But it's right up on the radar screen. Thank you.
I heard somebody say, "Oh no."
Oh, so does that mean I'm done?
Ray Polani, a City Club member. You mentioned the relationship between services and housing.
Right.
And I wonder if you'd care to comment about the relationship between transportation costs as a portion of disposable income and housing. In other words, if you don't spend so much on transportation, you obviously can spend more on housing. And of course, that could lead to proximity to public transportation, which would be less expensive.
I'll tell you why I absolutely agree, and it's important, and I'll give you an illustration that shows that that's important to us at the department. When I started in July of a year ago, and I described to you what the department looked like, I went to the legislature in September, so I'd only been in the job for 2 months, and I asked for 2 positions. One was a development officer to provide technical assistance, and the other was a land use planner to work with LCDC and hopefully to work with TriMed and those other entities dealing with the issue of where we locate the housing along transportation corridors. That commute, it doesn't make sense to locate all the low-income housing on the east side of town when the jobs are going to be on the west side of town and they're going to have to commute across. And it's just not something that we've really done very well, and we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to that. So the planner that we have on board, once his time is ended in developing this comprehensive strategy, which is what I have him working on, he's going to be over there working with LCDC, working with the Department of Transportation, because I'll tell you, the Department of Transportation probably never knew who we were up until about a year ago, but that's not the case anymore.
Marilyn Miller, City Club member. Hi, Ray.
Hi.
It's nice to find another believer in community action. I thought we'd all died in the 60s. I have a question. As someone who was involved in community action back then, and when funds directly came from the federal government to the agencies providing the services, times have changed. Right. And funds now go from federal, who take a cut to administer, they come to state, who take a cut to administer, then they go to local and take a cut. My question to you, in order to maximize these housing dollars, what are you going to do to ensure that they don't end up going into administrative and paperwork positions rather than getting to actually producing housing?
The first thing we did when we merged the 2 departments was eliminate one of the high-paid positions in the community service side. We just got rid of that, so that money will automatically flow through to the community action agencies. And then we lowered another position, so there is automatically, right off the top, we were able to identify that. In addition, we are not funded by the general fund as a department. We've used our bond earnings to handle a lot of our staffing. Over time, as we integrate more and more of the community service process, some of those dollars will help subsidize some of the administrative duties that we have through the community action programs, and we're going to pass that through. We're going to pass as much of that through as we can. And so, as I said, right out of the blocks, I was just able to go in and say, we're going to eliminate that spot and lower that spot. And we're going to pass that money through. So you'll see a savings in that. And then over time, you'll see more of that as we incorporate more and continue, hopefully, to sell bonds and be able to earn enough to be able to handle that. So my objective is to get as much through locally as possible. And you'll never see us grow to a size that's unmanageable, because I believe in local delivery systems. And the caps have to be successful if we're going to be successful. If they're a failure, I'm a failure. That's just how it is.
Mary McWilliams, City Club member. You talked about the potential for public and private partnerships. And I think some businesses report that they have difficulty these days securing capital from banks for business expansion. And I wondered if you can foresee or experience or project whether you'll have difficulty securing that bank support for the housing investment that you'd like to see.
The banks look at, a lot of times equity is a major issue. And one of the things that the trust fund is able to do, since it is a grant, will be able to come in and be first money in a project. And that is, in essence, equity. That's going to make it a lot more likely for the bank to be able to lend on that. And then also, the trust fund is designed to use the $14 million as a partial guarantee of a project. So now the bank will be able to have some other insurances. We want to be able to attract them to the table. And that's why I see it as not just $6 million out of the chute, but more like $30 million or more. We're going to attract other dollars.
Claudia Burnett, City Club member.
Hi.
Yeah, I find your enthusiasm remarkably refreshing.
Thank you.
I am struck by your Hobbes quote and am reminded of another. I think it was Hobbes who said, "Life is nasty, brutish, and short."
That's right. He did. He did.
And as we all know, Hobbes didn't even live in the 1980s.
That's right.
My question is, I assume your enthusiasm is predicated on an assumption of an ability to deliver.
Yes.
Which must be predicated on the ability to follow through, to redirect our priorities. And I wonder what causes you to be enthusiastic.
That's a great question. A lot of people ask me that. As I mentioned earlier, I think part of it was when I shared that story with you about where I came from. And I just have some personal beliefs in being able to change things. And see? They answered it for me. My background, when I used to go to school in Philadelphia, and I had a lot of problems with reading and other things, and to be able to get here, I always keep that belief that you can make a change and where you're headed. And so part of that is inner strength that I have about where I've come from. The other part is that we had a terrible reputation in housing, and the housing agency, I feel, or no reputation at all, just 14 months ago. And I remember Neil Goldschmidt saying to me that what people used to say was that if we gave you guys $2 million, people were saying that you wouldn't know what to do with it. And so I said, in a year, that's not going to be the case. We had all that support and drive and direction from the people who pushed for the trust fund. But when you're sitting up there in front of Ways and Means, one of the key things you're looking at is what is the capacity of that department to handle those funds? We weren't talking about $2 million, we were talking about 25. We were talking about all those tools. And in that short period of time, they felt not only could they merge another agency with us and allow us to really run it, or me in particular, but then they felt they gave us $25 million and we could do something with it and get bipartisan support within a year. So did we make changes? Yes. We added the land use planner 2 months into the position. We added the land use planner, something we were never doing before. We wanted the development officers. We added them. Every piece of legislation that we got behind during this session, that we either were in the forefront or were supporting, we got every one of them. We're talking 100%. We have legislation for mobile homes. We have a variety of things that we got out of this session. That's quite a record. So that is a reason for optimism. And I just believe in people. And that's the only way we're going to get there. And I can't do it just with a bureaucratic state program just doling out some dollars. It's not going to work well that way. And that's why I mentioned earlier, if the cap fails, I fail. So I've got to do everything possible to make sure they're successful, whether it's holding them accountable, whether it's getting mad at them, whether it's encouraging them and challenging them. That's the only way we're going to measure our success. I don't want to go back 18 months at the next session and say, I've saved you a little money and that's it. Just not quite good enough.
I think we have time for one last question.
Another lawyer.
Bob Crooks, City Club member. All right.
Hi.
From perspective of someone deep in the affordable housing trenches, I've got to say your leadership has had tremendous impact and has really had a big influence on the housing landscape, at least since I've been in town. I have a question relating to use of housing trust funds. Nonprofits have a crying need for pre-development dollars, site acquisition costs, feasibility studies, design and development costs, and those kinds of monies with a flexible expectation of repayment are very scarce. Do you have any sense of what portion of your $14 million would go towards funding pre-development for nonprofit development?
We haven't determined an amount yet, Bob, but we are definitely going to set aside a percentage. I'm just not quite sure what it is. We have one program already called the seed money, and that's already oversubscribed for, and that's only a $100,000 fund, and we give out 5 here, 10 there, 20 there. And so obviously, from that experience, we know that there's that much demand on 100, so we need to probably double, triple that and get to a point where we're somewhat comfortable. And then we're hoping that we've just hired an architect recently to be able to help people and nonprofits with their plans and designs from the private sector, from the large Gunzel architecture firm. We were able to recruit him. So we're going to try to provide as many services as we can to lower some of those development costs and then use the trust fund. So you'll know fairly soon here as we finish up with the rules what the dollar amount will be, but we're going to at least double and triple the $100,000 investment that we've got set aside right now. Thank you.
Ray, thanks again for those remarks, and we all look forward to following the progress of what you were talking about, and I think you can tell by the response that you received here today that your remarks did touch a strong note of interest with all of us. And again, thank you very much for coming to City Club. We are adjourned.